I think we're just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're really still missing a kind of new generation of entrepreneurs who are going to sort of work on some of these really, really tricky problems. And I think it's actually on the private sector and on entrepreneurs to be the people leading this change, because it's not going to come from government. Government is stuck all across the Western world. It's not centralised bureaucracies that are going to solve the problems of homelessness, of climate change, of social mobility, of drug addictions. It's going to be innovative private sector organisations that drive that growth.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Joe Seddon, founder and chief executive officer of Zero Gravity, the award-winning social mobility platform that helps talented students from low opportunity backgrounds reach top universities and careers. Founded from his childhood bedroom in West Yorkshire with the last £200 of his student loan, Zero Gravity has since supported more than 8,000 students into leading universities, including over 800 to Oxbridge, and distributed more than £1.5 million in scholarships. Joe has been widely recognised for combining technology and purpose to tackle one of the UK's most entrenched challenges, educational inequality. Joe, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Great to be on the podcast.
It's great to have you. So, Joe, what first sparked your desire to tackle social mobility? Was there a single moment you realized the system needs to change?
Well, like most entrepreneurs, rather than having this sudden kind of moment of genius where the world suddenly presents itself to me, instead I focused on solving what was actually a very personal problem, which is I grew up in a small town in the north of the UK called Morley, which is kind of equidistant between Leeds and Wakefield. It's a sort of post-industrial market town. And I was brought up in a single parent family. My mum works as a speech therapist in the National Health Service. I just sort of saw firsthand how difficult it is for young people like me growing up in those sort of backgrounds who may have all of the kind of, ambition and motivation and boldness to try and do something with their life, but not necessarily the opportunity on their doorstep. And I was one of the lucky ones. I managed to find my way to a place at Oxford University, which was an absolutely life-transforming moment, but also something that made me an incredible outlier where I grew up. Not a single person in the year that I graduated from Oxford University from the hometown that I lived in won a place at university. And then the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Lack of financial resources, lack of network, lack of people working professional occupations, poor quality schooling. All these things kind of add up and compound across people's lives to give them a sense that they don't have a chance to succeed. So when I graduated from university, I wanted to do something about that problem that I faced myself, and that's how Zero Gravity was born.
And what is Zero Gravity now, in terms of size, reach, services? How does it work as a business? What does it look like?
So I started it originally from my student bedroom with the last 200 quid of my student loan. So it was very much humble beginnings, a sort of typical bedroom startup. But today, we've got 25 full-time employees in the UK. We work with over 40 enterprise companies. As of this year now, actually, we've supported over 20,000 students from low opportunity backgrounds into top universities in the UK. They raised £6.5 million of equity investment. All of these sort of things would have seemed completely impossible when I started my journey. But I think it just shows that if you have an idea that genuinely solves a real problem that people have, and not just any problem, a problem which is genuinely painful for people and makes a big difference in their life, if you can get that right, it is possible to scale something, even if you start from very little resources in the way I did back in my bedroom 7 years ago.
You talk about powering students into uni, work, and life. As a practical matter, what does that mean?
So we're in the business of unlocking people's potential. And when you look at the kind of landscape of social mobility, not just in the UK, but in all advanced economies, you see that around 70% of the kind of persistence of income across generations comes down to education. So if your parents didn't go to university, if your parents they didn't complete their exams at school, it's very likely that you are as well. So what we try and do is we try and break that link between background and opportunity. So we very much focus on how do we get people into the most elite educational establishments. And then once they've done that, how do we actually make sure they can take all of that kind of learning and knowledge that they've assembled and convert it into that very first job? So we focus on getting people to these elite institutions, not because we kind of fetishize the institutions themselves, but because by looking at the data, those are the things that make the really, really big difference in terms of putting people from low income backgrounds onto a completely different life trajectory.
It seems to me you've done something, it's not necessarily unique, but certainly a little bit different for somebody who's looking at a social problem, a societal problem, and that you've built a for-profit, mission-driven company to tackle it. So, how'd you design the business model to align the commercial sustainability with impact? What's the revenue model? Who pays who for what?
Well, in the UK, we've got this binary distinction between charities on the one hand and then businesses on the other. And I think that in most people's minds, charities are associated with being kind of morally virtuous. They're focused on solving social problems with no kind of perverse incentives. Whilst businesses are seen as kind of morally agnostic, profit-seeking organizations. But in my mind, as a kind of Gen Z who grew up in an age where the businesses drove a lot of social change, whilst charities were often embroiled in corruption scandals, that binary distinction didn't hold true for me. I think charities, just like any forms of organisation, have their own incentives, whether it's the kind of ego, status, chasing after certain forms of philanthropic funding. The charities are not kind of perfect, morally virtuous organisms. And at the same time, businesses, although they do ultimately come down to market forces and driving value for shareholders, can create real social progress in the process of doing that. Now, when I think of some of the kind of defining organizations of my lifetime that have solved social problems in, say, like the environment and climate change, the vast majority of those have been businesses, whether it's renewable energy businesses. Octopus Energy in the UK is one of the biggest energy providers, whether it's businesses like Tesla, who completely transformed not only the ability to store renewable energy, but also to use it to get around towns and cities. A lot of the defining organizations have actually been for-profit companies rather than charities. So I passionately believe that you don't have to be compromising on your mission if you take the for-profit route like I did. And indeed, the reason I went down that route is because I actually thought the incentives made more sense in order to build a scalable solution to the social problem that I was trying to tackle.
Do you see other problems like the one that zero gravity is addressing, that someone else could take a similar approach and begin to address that in a different way, in an effective way? And there are probably people out there doing that I'm not aware of, but are there areas that you can see that aren't addressed and you kind of go, if I could just clone myself, I'd do that one too? Is there something else out there?
100%. When you look at a social problem, which you can apply the kind of quote unquote zero gravity approach to, I think there's two core features you should be looking for. One is a kind of social problem where there is a kind of lockstep between creating social impact and commercial impact. A lot of people think that those social problems have to be solved by charities because the kind of monetary impact is a kind of externality that you can't capture. But I would actually push back on that and actually say that if you have a kind of innovative enough business model, often it is possible to capture at least some of the value you're creating as an organization. Make that example concrete. And the people used to say you can't make any money out of social mobility because it's impossible to charge the students that any value you create for them by getting them into a better university or getting them into a better career is kind of an externality that you can't monetize. But what I saw is actually employees in universities were getting a huge amount of benefit from getting their hands on this talent. And those are institutions that you could monetize and you could capture some of that externality. So we were able to sort of create a new commercial model in a sort of problem space that people traditionally saw as the realm of charities. I think the second thing to look for is actually an ability to disrupt the sort of traditional operating model in a sector. A lot of sectors which are dominated by kind of governmental and third sector organisations tend to have pretty old school operating models because, lo and behold, if you're in a sector where there isn't any market forces, there isn't too much of a kind of impetus to disrupt your kind of mode of operating or ways of thinking. That creates a huge opportunity to create new forms of operating model that can drive social impact. And that's what I saw with Zero Gravity. No one was building proprietary technology to try and identify top talent from low income background and then take it on that journey into elite institutions. Now, no one was utilizing the economies of scale that you get through digital platforms or the network effects you can create by bringing a community of people together in a social network. These are all sort of forces that traditional tech companies have been able to capture and utilize, but traditional social organizations haven't. So I saw an ability to disrupt the operating model as well. And that's the second feature I would look for in that kind of problem space if you're thinking about doing this.
So who pays? If I've got it right, you're saying universities that are looking for students that they want to have, but they kind of can't find a way to attract or convince that they'll feel at home or whatever the obstacles are. They can't get them over the obstacles. You give them a way to do that. Employers that are looking for people from different backgrounds, you give them a way to do that. So who pays and how do they pay?
So we partner with the kind of talent functions of employers and universities to essentially make it easier for them to recruit top talent from low income backgrounds. When you take a sort of typical blue chip employer, they will all have these kind of internal talent teams that every year have a mandate to recruit X number of people for their graduate program, X number of people for their internship program, and X number of people for their apprenticeship program. And in order to do that, they have to do a variety of things, build awareness of their company, get people to apply, get them through the selection processes, and then actually convert those people into offers at the end of the process. You can think of it almost as like a pipeline from start to finish. And what we do at Zero Gravity is we put incredible talent from low income backgrounds on their pipeline. And even better than that, we make sure they don't actually fall off that conveyor belt at any point in the process. So the sort of talent on our platform doesn't lose out on these jobs just through a lack of kind of network knowledge or lack of an inside track, to be honest. And the reason that has value for these companies is because of the opportunity cost to them, which is if they didn't work with us, they'd have to sort of take this scattergunner approach of trying to work through schools and universities and running on the ground events. So there's a kind of opportunity cost element. But the second kind of more unspoken about element is actually the productivity benefit, which is a lot of the partners we've worked with have actually got really hard data now, not just about the macroeconomy, but about their own workforce, showing a causal link between recruiting people from low-income backgrounds and productivity. Now, KPMG, for instance, who was one of our very first partners, did a study on all of their UK employees and found that some of their highest billing partners and senior associates were from working class backgrounds. And then McKinsey, another one of our partners, did a macroeconomic study and found that actually in the Western world, we've got really inefficient talent matching between skills and jobs. If we could get that right, we could unlock around £39 billion of GDP just in the UK. So a lot of the companies we work with now, they have this data, either at the macro level or the firm level. And I know if they get this right, it actually drives the bottom line. It's not just the right thing to do for CSR reasons or something that sort of makes their brand look great. It can actually have an impact on their profit and loss. And ultimately, if you want a big business to do something, you've got to find a way to connect it to the bottom line.
So how do you keep people, kind of on that conveyor belt in the pipeline? What do they actually do that ups their odds?
It's sort of like any sort of social platform, any media platform. It ultimately comes down to retention. Like, how do you build a product experience which is so good that not only do people want to come back, but almost it becomes habitual, it becomes addictive. Now, people don't make a rational choice to kind of open their phone and doom scroll on TikTok every day or to sit down on the sofa in the evening and turn on Netflix. It's almost unconscious because it becomes habitual. So that's what we've really focused on. How do we make putting in the work to get into one of these elite universities, not just fun, but habitual? Then the way we do that is we recruit students at the age of 16. It's a mobile app fundamentally. That is how we deliver our product experience. And what we do is we sort of break down into bite-sized chunks the things you need to actually be successful and get a place at these top universities. So if you're applying to try and get into Oxford University, for instance. We'll partner with you with a mentor who currently studies at Oxford. We've got all this fantastic content that we produce with the university that gives you a sense of how to get in. We've built really cool sort of exclusive opportunities on the platform where you can get down to one of these colleges and see what it's like. And we've sort of delivered that in a kind of digital environment where that doesn't feel like a chore, but actually feels like something that's fun and addictive. Every time you're opening the app, there's something there new for you to do. So I think this is where a lot of traditional charities and governmental organisations have gone wrong. They haven't got their kind of minds in the game of how do you attract and engage a Gen Z audience, where your key competitor is not the other kind of third sector organisations trying to recruit those students, but it's actually the other apps and media organisations they're engaging with every day. Like when it comes to zero gravity, we're essentially trying to nick an hour of screen time every day from TikTok that students will instead root for our platform rather than doom scrolling on the phone in the evening.
Yeah, really interesting. Even as we're talking about it, I can imagine all sorts of lessons in there for lots of other people who are trying to do, whether it's a charity or they're trying to do something like zero gravity, lots and lots of sort of practical things in there. Taking it into a slightly more abstract direction, just for a minute, how do you define purpose in your work? And how's that evolved as the company's grown?
I think you need to try and define your why, like your reason for existence, or to put it in, I suppose, more personal terms, like why bother getting up in the morning? It's really hard work building a startup. So if there's not a reason for you to sort of get out of bed and sort of open up your laptop at 9 a.m. every day and put in those 12-hour shifts, it's going to be really difficult to persevere. Like when I think about the why behind zero gravity, that was very easy for me because that was so personal to my own journey. I was essentially helping the next generation of students. I would just be thinking about, ultimately, at the most kind of emotional level, what is it that your product or organization actually changes in the lives of the people that use it? At the most kind of abstract emotional level, why would anybody use your product? And absolutely nailing that is key to your brand positioning, because ultimately people buy into what you do not because of the kind of rational reasons or the features. They buy into what you do because of the outcomes and how those outcomes make them feel. So if you really crystallize that why, it makes it much easier not just to build a purpose-driven, mission-driven organization, but build a brand that genuinely resonates with your core customer.
And over the 7 years, if I've got it right, you've grown from sort of an idea into a national platform, thousands of students. What were the big strategic decisions that allowed you to scale without losing sort of that personal connection to the mission?
All comes down to focus and saying no. So the number one rule of strategy is deciding what not to do. And this is where I think a lot of first-time founders go wrong, because they don't have the kind of discipline of trying to reduce and simplify their idea to the kind of sort of smallest thing possible, and then absolutely executing perfectly on that one very simplified thing. And the way I thought about that at the start of my journey is I knew that I wanted to create this kind of marketplace platform where ultimately we'd be connecting the top talent from low-income backgrounds and employees at universities. But I knew it was going to be too difficult at the beginning of my journey to try and get these big blue chip employers and prestigious universities to sort of partner with me to make that happen. So what I focused on was just the kind of consumer side of the marketplace. What are the things I can do without institutional support to get that side of what I do absolutely rocking? So the first couple of years, I just relentlessly focused on that. We didn't make any material revenue. We didn't kind of build into our operating model a reliance on institutional partnerships. We just absolutely went after the B2C element. And then once that started working, getting the other side of the marketplace right, and getting those B2B partnerships, getting people embedded, making sure they got value out of the products, that was much easier because of the B2C stuff that we set up. So I encourage any founder, even if you've got a kind of wide-ranging vision, even if you want to change the world, reduce your idea to the simplest thing possible at the very beginning and execute to perfection on that before then looking at how you widen that out over time.
I think that's great advice. Not that I necessarily always follow it, but I think it's great advice. What do you look at? What metrics, what indicators can you track that actually helps you know that you're not just helping these students get into university, but that it sort of fosters ongoing social mobility. That by doing that, they're going to have a good time at university. They're going to be successful. Obviously, not everybody's going to be, but that they've got as good a shot as anybody, that they're going to get a good job. That's going to go on to a good life. I mean, that means a lot. So how do you know that's really working?
The beauty of building a digital product is there's so much quantitative data that you can collect. So I would advise any founder building a digital product, like make sure that right at the beginning of your journey, you are building in the kind of systems and tools to collect this quantitative data. And I think the rule should be collect as much as possible, because you'll never know in the medium to long term exactly what you should be looking at. So making sure you've actually got the data collection and measurement bit right at the beginning will give you the actual agency to sort of shift how you look at your business moving forwards. In terms of actually clarifying like what you should spend your time obsessing about, one of the things you need to do is sort of break your metrics into the kind of like long-term outcomes, which are probably going to be quite lagged indicators. The things that aren't going to change day to day, week to week, but are the things that really matter year to year. And we need to work out what are the key drivers of those long-term outcomes, like the kind of leading indicators that are changing on a day-to-day basis. So from a zero gravity perspective, like we knew that the big long-term outcome for us was, are we actually shifting students' chances of getting to top universities and careers? Now, when you look at their success rates, do we actually make a causal impact on those success rates? But the difficulty with that is you only get that data once per year. Now that you have a sort of single application cycle every year for university and careers. So if that's all that you were tracking, if that's all you're obsessing about, you won't have a very good feedback loop between doing something and then finding out whether it works or not. So that's the kind of long-term lagged indicator. But we had to work out, okay, what are the key drivers of getting to that long-term outcome? And the key thing for us was the kind of retention and engagement metrics on our platform. Now, we found that if you can get somebody in the first 7 days of having signed up to connect with a mentor, their chance of being retained in our platform long term was dramatically higher than if you didn't get them into a mentoring match. We also found if a student spent 10 hours of time on our platform over a 6-month period, the impact on them getting into university was significant, whilst the impact of them only spending a couple of hours was relatively negligible. So we sort of found these kind of leading indicators, and that informed the kind of metrics that we look at every day now, like activation rates, retention rates, churn rates, and how many people are hitting certain benchmarks of engagement. And that just creates so much clarity and focus around how you build your business, because if you want to influence this big long-term outcome, here are all the different levers you can potentially pull. So build that tree of the long-term outcomes and then the drivers that ladder up to it, and you'll have such clarity about how you should be building your business long-term.
Just on that, have the metrics you're looking at gotten more nuanced, more complex? So it's not just about number of hours engagement. It's not strictly linear. The first few hours doesn't really make much difference, but when you go deeper, then it starts to pay off. Has that changed over a number of different metrics?
This is why you should be collecting as much data as possible, because no one gets it right the first time. No one is the kind of master business strategist who can sit down in a dark room when they're starting a business and perfectly plot out what their kind of long-term drivers of success are going to be. You can have an idea about it, you can have some hypotheses, but no one gets it right. So the reason you want to collect as much data as possible is so you can actually start to finesse these metrics over time as you learn more about your business. So for instance, like we worked out for us that actually when it came to activation, looking at what people did in the first 7 days was more important than looking at what they did in the first 14 days, because the first 7 days is a predictor of long-term engagement, whilst the first 14 days is a much weaker predictor. I didn't know that when I first started the business. I only learned that over time by following the quantitative data. So collect as much as possible so you can finesse the metrics long term, but you should be constantly learning and adapting your plan. If you're not doing that, I would suggest that you're not being inquisitive enough about the quantitative data that you've got.
And are you figuring all that out kind of old-fashioned, just looking at the data and drawing graphs and whatever, or are you using any kind of machine learning, large language model, AI kind of tools?
For most of the journey, it was just humans analysing quantitative Data. This is where it actually really helps to make sure you've got good statistical literacy in your team. One of the core concepts I've seen that a lot of young people don't have coming out of school is just some pretty standard things like the differences in averages, mean, median, mode, like concepts like variance, statistical significance. I would make sure that anybody who works in a position where they're working with quantitative data has these concepts in their kind of mental toolkit. If they don't have that, you can make bad decisions in the long term when suddenly you've invested £500,000 of marketing budget into something that might not actually really work. So you have to have that toolkit. But I'd say human beings interpreting data with the right toolkit, they can actually work out a lot of things regarding what are the metrics you should be focusing on and what are the things that actually influence them. But you're absolutely right. I do think AI presents a kind of new route to be able to analyze data and pick up trends that the human eye may miss.
And as the organization matures and gotten to a next level, what's scale mean? Are you looking for more users, a bigger geographic footprint, kind of extending beyond that first job? What's the vision there?
I think for a mission-driven business, it's got to be how do you scale your impact? And I think what's exciting about this technological revolution that we're currently in the very first stages of is it's now possible to scale your impact without necessarily having to scale the size of your organization. We've already seen a number of high-profile organizations that have sort of scaled to multi-millions of users and multi-millions of pounds of revenue with very small teams of 20 and 30 people. And I think those kind of outlier companies are increasingly going to become the norm over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's really exciting because I think you can become a category defining company now with a very small team. And that might sound obvious, but I think that's a really important point to land culturally in an organization, that success doesn't have to mean hiring a new person every week, or success doesn't have to mean sort of moving into the big new gleaming office in the kind of skyscraper building. The success is actually being able to have a real mark on your customers and create huge impact. And it's even more impressive if you can do that with a small team, because it also means you can sort of be more financially generous with the team members that you've got. So I'd encourage people not to equate impact growth with organizational growth, especially in this new era that we're moving into now with AI as such a key enabler for every single digital business.
You're sort of operating in a space, that lots of other players in that space, many of them charities, many of them fairly small. How do you collaborate practically, or do you not, with the existing players in the field? Do you try and find ways to work together with them? Do you kind of say, they do that, so we don't need to? Or do you just kind of go, this is what we're doing, and they can do what they do, and we're going to do what we do?
It depends what you mean by collaborate. Like from a sort of partnerships point of view and actually spending business time and resource on partnering, I would encourage people in mission-driven businesses or in sectors that have a social element to be very, very careful about partnering with incumbents. That there's a kind of natural tendency in spaces that are solving a social problem for everybody to kind of gather around the fire pit and kind of dance the kind of social impact song, because everyone wants to feel like they're part of a grand movement. But ultimately, unless that stuff is having an impact on the end user, it's a kind of waste of time and energy. So I would suggest be very, very careful on which organizations you spend time partnering with. Like what that meant from a zero gravity perspective is we partnered with schools because we knew we needed them for acquisition. That's where our members come from. We partner with university and employers because they are the people who actually create the opportunities our members want to get into. But when it came to kind of the third sector organisations who are running these on the ground projects, and often locally and at small scale, we actually didn't build those into our core model because we didn't see any kind of need or dependency, to be completely blunt, to incorporate that. And we knew if we tried to partner with 50, 100 different third sector organisations, it was going to be too operationally intensive for the amount of incremental impact we could get out of it. So we were very focused and disciplined, and we said, no, we're not going to spend time and resource doing this. We're just going to focus on our core competencies. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be adversarial. Now, we actually see kind of local smaller initiatives as somewhat complementary to what we're doing if they kind of raise the aspirations of our members and also provide an additional form of kind of on the ground personalized support. So like I would definitely encourage people in the social impact sector to not be hostile, because at the end of the day, if you want to create a social impact brand, being too hostile and adversarial to the status quo is likely to land you in hot water, very, very quickly. So that is a sort of delicate tightrope to walk. How do you remain focused, remain disciplined without kind of cheesing off the people in the sector that you're in? And often a lot of tech platforms have had to kind of walk that tightrope very, very delicately.
It sounds like your image of Zero Gravity is much more as a tech business that has a social impact than a social impact organization.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's a binary divide between social impact on the one side and commercial impact on the other. So I would rather be in the kind of bucket of sort of tech startup organizations, because from a cultural point of view, that's the kind of culture we're trying to create internally. And if you walked into our office, it would look far more like a kind of Silicon Valley style tech startup than it would be a kind of Westminster based NGO or third sector organization. But then also from a talent point of view as well, to be able to succeed scaling a kind of company, you have to have incredible talent density in your organization. And the brutal reality is it's really difficult to build talent density in third sector organizations because they can't compensate at market rate. And often, even though you've got a really strong sense of purpose and mission, you can't offer people the kind of career development that comes with being part of a kind of scaling organization. So I think from a talent density point of view as well, we wanted to attract a kind of ambitious startup style of person rather than someone who might have been a little bit more comfortable working for a traditional kind of public sector or NGO organization. So that was really important for us, which is why we've always tried to sort of put ourselves in the tech startup bucket, even though we've got a clear mission and social purpose.
So, viewed as a startup, if I've got it right, you've got about 25 full-time employees.
In the UK, yeah.
Are there full-time employees somewhere else?
We've got 5 people working in the Far East as well. We've got a sort of small remote software engineering squad out there. I was originally quite reluctant to kind of outsource any of the kind of core functions of the organization. But actually, one of the things I've learned over time is when outsourcing is done well, it can really work. When it's done badly, that's when you get into problems. What we found is that actually, if you have the right network in a certain country and you're able to kind of bridge the kind of language and cultural divide and actually embed people into your company systems and ways of working, being able to open yourself up to an international talent base is such a competitive advantage over having to recruit in a sort of single geographic entity, which for us would be kind of London, which is only around 7 or 8 million people, and also has sort of market rate salaries which are significantly higher than in most of the rest of the world. So that was something that I was closed-minded to at the beginning of my journey, but I'm far more open-minded now. And I think kind of COVID has accelerated this trend in many businesses because a lot of businesses didn't have very good asynchronous systems for working prior to the pandemic, whilst now even your most kind of the Luddite, slow-moving organisations will have Microsoft Teams. Company systems, even without people really thinking, have become far more cloud-based and asynchronous than they were 3 years ago due to the pandemic effect.
Where are you in the sort of evolution to being cash flow neutral to cash generative?
We're sort of still a good 2 or 3 years away from that at our current growth rate. I think from a startup point of view, that is hopefully a sign of optimism. In the median scenario for us, we can make the business sustainable in the long term. The things that we've got to do to be able to achieve that is essentially to be able to continue to embed our product as the go-to talent provider for kind of enterprise employers and top universities in the UK. If we can do that, we can turn this into a cash flow positive organization, which is not just great news for our shareholders who put their kind of risk capital into the company to be able to grow it in the early days, but it's also great news for our members as well, because it actually puts our destiny in our own hands. I think all organizations should strive to be cash flow positive in the long term.
I've long believed that the best way to get something done is to be sustainable. And that includes being financially sustainable, and the best way to grow is to be cash generative.
Exactly. Like there's a reason that capitalism works. Capitalism in many ways is the kind of miracle of modern times. When you look at not just things like GDP per capita, but also the percentage of people across the globe living in absolute poverty, market forces are the things over the past 100 years that have really changed the kind of quality of billions of people's lives. And that doesn't mean markets are perfect. We've got market failure, but they are the best forces we know for creating social progress. I think that perfectly applies to business like Zero Gravity, because if we don't ultimately get our members into these top universities and top jobs, we get fired by our partners. We lose revenue. That is a market force that literally slaps you around the face and tells you, you're not doing good enough job. You're doing the wrong things. And that is the kind of feedback loop you want to build in any mission-driven organization. Whilst if you work for a charity that is maybe dependent on one funder, whether it be the government or some philanthropic organization, you don't get that market force. You might have your kind of once per year impact reporting session where you sort of present your brochure or your kind of finely curated presentation. And as long as that 90-minute session goes well, you get your funding renewed for another year. That completely destroys your incentives to actually do the right things that create impact long term. So market forces are a competitive advantage for any organization, which is why I would build something sustainable rather than going to the easy option of going for philanthropy and grant funding.
There's a tendency for organizations, for systems to become conservative with a small c, to remain the way they are. Whereas it sounds to me like a big part of your business model, and you kind of voiced it there with a certain amount of energy, which I thought was great, is sort of if you're not disrupting the system, if you're not getting people into university seats that wouldn't have been there anyway, if you're not doing something different, you're not doing your job. There's something in the whole thing that drives it to be positively disruptive.
Exactly, and the economist Joseph Schumpeter had a great expression for this, which was the force of creative destruction in capitalism. And what that means is that essentially market forces over time, they work out what innovations should get capital and should grow, and what innovations should fail because they're fundamentally not good enough. And those forces clearly are at work in the private sector. No businesses fail every single day because of their inability to actually create a solution to a problem. Whilst the kind of failure rate for kind of large charities is few and far between, and almost it's seen as a kind of moral quandary if a charity is at risk of going bust. But that should tell you that an organisation fundamentally isn't doing its job in creating social impact. So I think we need to get comfortable with the idea that mission-driven companies should be allowed to fail. That is no bad thing, because that is the thing that's going to create that creative destruction effect in the long term, which leads to a far more vibrant economy.
One last question before we go, which is really just, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
We spoke a little bit at the beginning about the sort of zero gravity style of organization, applying the kind of market forces and the tech-based operating model to solving a social problem. I think we're just the tip of the iceberg. I think we're really still missing a kind of new generation of entrepreneurs who are going to sort of work on some of these really, really tricky problems. And I think it's actually on the private sector and on entrepreneurs to be the people leading this change, because it's not going to come from government. Government is stuck all across the Western world. It's not centralized bureaucracies that are going to solve the problems of homelessness, of climate change, of social mobility, of drug addictions. It's going to be innovative private sector organisations that drive that growth. So I would just encourage people who are thinking about building a business or getting into entrepreneurship, look at those problems that government is currently failing to address, particularly those ones that you may have experienced firsthand, and start there, because that is where all the action is. And if you can get that right, you'll be doing a great service, not just for yourself, but for everyone in the country.
Well, Joe, for someone who has long believed in the power of for-profit organizations to do good things, that's just such a great note to end on. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us. Look forward to hearing where you and Zero Gravity get to.
Great to be on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. Please email any questions or suggestions to Belden@Menkus.com. reimagined.com. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher. If you enjoyed this episode, we release a new episode weekly. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.